other places in the world that are quite like New York City. Its status as a cultural mecca has lent itself as a home to some of the most important artistic movements of the last century. For decades, artists and musicians have flocked to the city in search of a chance to make it big time, or even just be with the people who are living on the fringes of American society. The city is a notorious birthplace for hip-hop, as well as some of rock's most influential moments. In Manhattan's Greenwich Village, the hippie movement of the early 60s was born. Youth from across the country had flocked to the village as part of the counterculture, fight against war and oppression. It was the folk music of the Greenwich Village residents that would go on to produce arguably one of the greatest American songwriters of all time. It was the albums of Dylan's time in the village that secured him as the figurehead of the counterculture and influenced countless artists of his time.
You look at him and look at him talking or listening to him talking to reporters, and he was nobody's patsy, that's for sure.
I mean, sure, I could read it, and I read it on the airplanes, but I don't take it seriously. If I want to find out anything, I'm not going to read Time magazine. I'm not going to read Newsweek. I'm not going to read any of these magazines.
He was just a badass guy,
The messages of these early albums would inspire a generation. The hippie movement of the 1960s would peak at the Woodstock Festival in '69, but at the same time, a new generation of New Yorkers had a different plan for rock and roll. By the early 70s, the feeling was clear that the message behind the hippie movement had faded. Rock music had gone somewhat mainstream and potentially lost some of its original integrity. It was the small clubs of Manhattan's East Village that would give birth to a whole new era of rock music. In the East Village, the legendary CBGB's Club made a name for itself as the venue for the most gritty, underground rock acts of all time, embracing everything that the rock scene of New York felt was the true essence of the music.
Where do you spend your money? On drugs.
He wanted punk to wipe out the hippies, blow up the whole world of rock and roll, and start all over again.
Bands that played at CBGB's were dangerous outlaws of the New York scene. This new wild, eccentric take on rock would go to be considered the most early roots of punk, glam, and new wave music. But by the end of the decade, a new musical craze had invaded the city. Uptown from CBGB's, legendary venues such as Studio 54 and Paradise Garage became the hub for disco and dance music of the late 70s. DJs in the Bronx pined at the ideas of hosting at such venues, or even getting into them for that matter. The youth of the inner city that were unable to make it into such exclusive clubs would take the party into their own hands, DJing block parties and playing the funk soul music of the time. DJs would isolate the breakbeat and begin freestyling their own lyrics over these songs, otherwise known as MCing. This technique would go on to become the fundamental of what was hip-hop music. This new style of DJing gave birth to breakdancing and graffiti art, creating an eccentric, artistic movement within the urban street culture. Innovators of this style would include Africa Bambaataa, Curtis Blow, as well as Grandmaster Flash. By 1979, MCing had taken over the disco craze, with credit due to the legendary Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang, hip-hop's notorious 20-minute introduction.
Now what you hear is not a test, I'm rapping to the beat. And me, the groove, and my friends are gonna try to move your feet.
With the commercial success of Rapper's Delight, hip-hop began to make waves to an outside audience of individuals in tune with club and dance music of the time. Artists and crews such as Boogie Down Productions, Slick Rick, Run DMC, and the Beastie Boys came into prominence. Groups like this introduced a more aggressive style of rapping and the use of an 808 bass drum loop. This sound single-handedly skyrocketed hip-hop into the mainstream. By the early 1990s, hip-hop had made its way across the ladder of the United States and taken its own form on the West Coast. Most notably, Dr. Dre's The Chronic and NWA's Straight Outta Compton solidified the West Coast sound, sparking competition between the East and West Coasts. But by 1993, New York had given birth to a new generation of rappers and sparked what we know today as the golden age of the genre. Hip-hop at this time was in something of a renaissance, with a new personality on every block. Everyone had a story to tell, and everyone needed to be heard. There was the political in the Bronx, the socially conscious and positive in Queens, the aggressive and violent in Staten Island, and the notorious and iconic out of Brooklyn. Of course, I'm speaking of Notorious B.I.G. and Nas.
Whose world is this?
The world is yours. The world is yours.
It's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Whose world is this? It's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Whose world is this?
The world is yours. The world is yours.
It's mine, it's mine, it's mine.
I sip the Don P, watching Gandhi till I'm charged and writing in my book of rhymes all the words past the margin.
Both Nas and Biggie had taken this new form of hip-hop all the way through to the mainstream, ushering in a new era of socially conscious and streetwise hip-hop artists, setting the standard for what hip-hop is and will continue to be. Today, New York is quiet, well, at least more so than we've seen it. Rock, punk, hip-hop have all since left the confines of the city and found a new life in places across the globe. The songs of Dylan and the folk artists of the Greenwich Village remain some of the most influential songwriting of all time, while the punk music continues to stand as a leading form of rebellious music, taking new form and sprouting countless seminal bands and scenes outside New York City. Hip-hop will always live in the city, but is no longer in the golden era that we once had known. We can only be left wondering what is to come next.